Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of the Berkeley Humanities faculty in dialogue about a recently published book. Before we get started, let me announce another Townsend Center event that will take place later today. We will feature an installment in our ongoing series titled Remaking Sense, the Humanities in Pandemic Culture. Today's event, which will begin at 4 p.m. Pacific time, will feature the poet John Choctaw, the musicologist Nicholas Matthew, and the cultural and visual studies critic Laura Perez, speaking on the theme of spirit in all of its many senses, from the spirit of music and art, to the spirit of place, to the spirit of the sacred, and perhaps even the spirit of scholarship. So please join us for that event later today. I also want to remind you that our book chat guests will talk for about 3/4 of an hour, after which they will entertain questions and comments from the audience. So feel free to use your YouTube chat function to contribute your questions and comments as we go. Today, it's a special pleasure to welcome Suzanne Guerlac, Professor Emerita of French at Berkeley, in conversation with Damon Young, Associate Professor of French and Film and Media Studies. They will be speaking about Professor Guerlac's newly published book, Proust, Photography, and the Time of Life. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn things over to our guests. Welcome, Suzanne and Damon.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure, Suzanne, to have you back here at Berkeley, as it were, and to be able to talk to you about this magnificent book, really a wonderful book, a magnum opus even, that brings together your work on Bergson and philosophy with a masterful and original reading of Proust. Obviously, there's many things written on Proust, but your work really brought À la recherche du temps perdu alive for me for the first time. And this is, of course, one of the most commented novels of all time. So the book is rich and gem-like, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get into some of its many threads, a little bit like Proust's own oeuvre. There's a lot of different ways we could go. But I thought I would begin by inviting you to read a little bit from the introduction, maybe to situate it for us, and then to speak about why you wrote this book, to launch our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Damon, and thank you so much for being here on screen with me. I'm going to read the very first paragraph of the introduction, which basically just sets out the intent of the book, and then say a few words. Okay. Proust's famous novel has been subjected to aesthetic capture for the last 100 years. À la recherche du temps perdu has been taken both to exemplify and to be principally about the powers of art. It's read as a vocation story. Marcel becomes a writer that hinges on involuntary memory as the aesthetic instrument that makes both Marcel's literary vocation and Proust's art possible. Proust becomes a writer of enchantment. Art redeems life, transmuting the dross of lived experience, disappointment, delay, repetition, and loss into essences, glimmering truths held before the reader thanks to the bracing powers of reminiscence and the transmuting virtuosity of style. It's an old story, but a remarkably tenacious one, and it lurks even in interpretations that at first glance appear to reject it. The monumental myth of Proust's work as a novel of artistic creation will retain its power until other Prousts are offered in its place. My ambition is to propose one here, fully aware that there can be no last word when it comes to Proust. So, like many of us, I had read and even taught Combray and parts of Finding Time Again, and I had read Swan in Love. But to read the whole novel in one volume with time to really immerse myself in it was another experience altogether. I found that none of my received ideas about Proust helped me at all account for the complexity of this novel or the intensity of its impact on me. So the first impulse towards this book was the feeling Josh needed to be opened up freed from the idealist assumptions that appeared to govern it, I felt I had to go back to square one. So the same friend who kindly had lent me that 1-volume Tadier edition of the Recherche at a propitious moment, I was between projects and on sabbatical, also lent me Brassai's study, Proust sous l'emprise de la photographie, recently published by Chicago in English, Proust in the Power of Photography, which both attuned me to the myriad photographic elements in Proust's novel that at that point, very few people were talking about. It's changed since, and gave me a new perspective on photography, which was the perspective of the photographer, and as a way of kind of offsetting the theoretical influences of the day, which were Barthes's position of the viewer, and Rosalind Krauss's sort of semiological analysis of indexicality. So Brassai's modest book helped me appreciate the wide range of photographic modalities at play in the Recherche, and inspired me to learn more about the history of photographic processes, practices, and discourses, which, by the way, I did thanks to a bridge grant from the Townsend Center, for which I'm remain very grateful. And also thanks to the resources of the Société Française de Photographie in Paris and their wonderful journal, Études photographiques. So photography seemed to open a path, or a promising path, towards another Proust for many reasons. First, its materiality, something that Jameson, among many others, talks about. Also, its historical independence from ideologies of fine art, its embeddedness in commercial and popular culture, and above all, its complex engagements with time. People speak of a will have been past time of photography. That's Chevrier does that in his Proust et la photographie. And the conjugation of various temporal horizons that come together when people speak of the fait photographique, which includes the time of taking the photograph, the time or times of processing it, of viewing it, and archiving it. So as I began work sort of launched in that direction, the question that demanded my attention was no longer sort of just how photography operates in Proust's novel, but what Proust's insistent engagement with photography might tell us about Proust's approach to time more generally. Although the frame of Proust's novel, the Combray and certain passages from Le Temps Retrouvé, poses an escape from time. But as one gets further into the novel itself, within that frame, the more Proust appears committed to exploring how to negotiate what he calls embodied time, time as it happens, what Ravesson called the time of change itself, and what I refer to as the time of life. And this includes also the dynamics of the collective or historical time of the novel's story, from the Third Republic to the First World War. So this broader reflection, opened up by the question of photography, called for philosophical reinforcements. I had been, of course, thinking about Bergson for years and deepening my understanding of his work since the publication of Thinking in Time. But I didn't want it to be just a sort of Proust-Bergson study. So in the end, I decided to engage with three interlocutors, three philosophers of life that were all contextually meaningful in relation to Proust. So that was important to me, that there be this horizon of discourses in conversation at a particular time. Félix Ravesson, the author of Habit, which concerns time as change and modes of coping with it. Bergson, the philosopher of time as duration, as invention, durational time. And thirdly, Georg Simmel, who ends his career with a quite Bergsonian reflections on time in his work called View of Life, even as this takes his philosophical reflections on money into what I would call an ontological register. So in the end, it turned out that to try to open up Proust required me to open up or enlarge my own philosophical repertoire. And so Rabelais is read as a philosopher of life, not as a mechanistic theorist of habit. Bergson's theory of memory takes the place often reserved for Freud. And Simmel takes the place one might expect Marx to hold in relation to questions of money. And Simmel's notion of modernity, of a modernity of money, takes the place of Benjamin as theorist of modernity. So what was new for me in this project then, and also why it took so long to complete, was the attempt to conjugate not just two systems or levels, literature and philosophy, which was something I had worked with in my previous work, but to try to juggle or to integrate three levels, three systems, as it were: literature or literarity, philosophy, and material popular culture in connection with photography. So you could say that the effort of this book was to return Proust to the world. Simmel speaks of money as a material that enables, quote, the presentation of relations between the most profound currents of individual life and history. This is the perspective that I wanted to bring to reading Proust. The book ends up challenging most received ideas about Proust's novel, not in order to undermine or diminish Proust, but on the contrary, to free him from a framework that risks rendering his work obsolete, in my opinion, unreadable or nostalgic, and to put him back into interaction with the world. It also challenges certain theoretical habits and loyalties by doing things differently. So I hope some of this will become clearer in my conversation with Damon.
Thank you. That's already enormously illuminating. And I also want to mention that the book is full of images. So there's almost a fourth strand. You have the literarity, the philosophical discourse, and the engagement with material culture, which is also the historical material. But then images are themselves doing a kind of work. They make the arguments resonate. They're often not images that are directly referenced by Proust, but that are related historically or kind of conceptually to the themes that you're drawing out. And I found that a very powerful aspect of the book, from portrait of Rodchenko to kind of Moholy-Nagy avant-garde images to kind of quasi-pornographic images that you might have seen in a stereoscope, to anonymous snapshots. So that's another aspect of the visual and the philosophical discursive registers are working together. So let me just say a few things. I mean, about, you've already given us a really great account of the book's aims and stakes. I'll say a few things about what stuck out to me while I was reading it, which was really, every page is an illumination. And in fact, the book is written as a series of these kind of almost photographic vignettes, kind of very short chapters that have a flashlight quality. They illuminate something, which, again, so it's almost like the form models the content in a way. So as you said, living in time is the subject of Proust's novel. This is a concept that you draw out in its philosophical richness and dictates its form. And it's an argument that insists on the immanence of time rather than the transcendence of life through art, and rather than on the vocation story or the story of aesthetic redemption. And so, again, to reiterate what you said, the conventional focus in the Proust scholarship on the opposition between voluntary and involuntary memory, which Proust himself emphasizes in the kind of frame narrative that you acknowledge and undo in your book, that, you know, in the first and the last volume, that emphasis, which has obsessed our has overdetermined our readings of Proust, reinforces what you call the idealist interpretation of Proust's novel, one he himself kind of is given to at times. And obviously we know that the Madeleine is the key episode in that very standard interpretation. And you also point out that this is a book that itself kept changing, that Proust was writing and revising until the day he died. So it is itself the time of life in its very production. And intriguingly, you show how Proust's narrative inscription of living in time with all of its complexity, it's far from an empirical, simple phenomenological or empirical experience, that takes place through the figure of photography. So photography is a figure for temporal processes in the book. For example, there are many examples, but when Proust refers to the inner dark room as a way of describing how the affective resonance of an encounter emerges after the event, after the time of exposure. So there's this temporality of anachronism that is often figured in photographic ways directly by Proust. But also as a kind of actual narrative presence in the book. And your account hinges around these three photographic scenes, one involving a portrait of the grandmother that she made as a kind of to have an image of herself to be remembered, but in which she was dying, and so there's this complex interweaving of life and death in that image. So that's an image in the novel, and then there's a blurry photograph of Albertine and her friends that as children on the beach that Marcel, the character, sees or remembers that's the kind of way that the Albertine character is introduced. And thirdly, there's your amazing reading of Odette. There's a daguerreotype that Swann keeps of her before she had kind of found her face, refashioned herself as a society woman. But there's also an image, a kind of photographic print of coins, ancient coins with portraits of knights on them that he gives to the Duke and the Duchess of Guermantes, that introduces your third very fascinating, I think more historical argument about the rise of a money economy, money as a kind of abstract leveler of values that liquidates the earlier aristocratic world and brings us into a modern world of celebrity. And this is all really, really fascinating. And also, as you said, that you do this through Simmel, Georg Simmel, the German sociologist and philosopher, rather than through Benjamin or Marx. Though they're present in the book. It's especially Benjamin, who I will ask you about if we have time. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to mention, that the bracketing of the idealist interpretation has a kind of affective corollary. So a shift in sensibility from the kind of melancholy, and also the readings of Proust as kind of skeptical and ironic. We move from skepticism, irony, and melancholy as dominant modes to the vitality of living in time, which is a complex vitality, certainly riven with suffering and joy, retrospection and projection, or as you put it in an intriguing formulation, we're moving from retrospection to retroaction. And so the novel becomes a novel of adventure, the adventure of living in time. Again, it's not a happy or optimistic formulation necessarily, but it is one that dislodges the melancholic interpretation that has also been dominant in Proust scholarship. And in reading the book or the novel, the series of books in relationship to the three philosophers you mentioned, all of whom are developing a philosophy of time, which is kind of an ontology of time, as you put it, that allows you to go against the grain, you write, of a tradition in Western philosophy which tends to spatialize time, as Bergson says, and therefore effaces the force of time as the invention of the new. And so this idea of invention, time as the very act or force of invention is present in your book and is really it's very exciting. Okay, so it's not a work of intellectual history so much as a work of philosophy, though you do situate, you establish that it may well be that Proust was aware of, certainly the work of Bergson and also Remembrance and Zimmel. So you do create kind of the intellectual cultural context out of which the novel emerges, but your point is not just to make these kind of historical connections, but rather to use these thinkers to develop a photographic philosophy of time. It's also a history of photography. So there's so many interwoven strands that I hope I'm being clear. Okay, so the three photographic scenes I mentioned, the grandmother's post-portrait. There is the photographic evocation of Albertine, which begins earlier in one of Proust's notebooks as a metaphor, and then actually becomes realized as an actual narrative element in the novel, and serves as a hinge between the original structure, which was a three-part structure that has the frame narrative of the Madeleine and Combray, but introduces the kind of massive digression of Albertine, which breaks the frame of the beginning and the ending, or the original tripartite structure, and introduces an incompatible kind of element that you pursue. And this was a very original reading of Albertine, who's often described and is often talked about, but this is a really innovative way of reading her presence in the novel, which I want to ask you about.
Can I just jump in and underscore a point that you made, and that is that the idealist reading is there in Proust. Right? It's not that people have just made something up and kind of been wrong, but the crucial thing is that the beginning of this 2,000-page novel that took 20 years to write, and he was still writing when he died, and the ending, the scenes in Le Temps Retrouvé, where the involuntary memory comes back, the napkin and so forth, and he then announces his vocation to become a writer. They were both written at the same time, right? So in fact, the ending is not an ending in that sense. And the ending of this huge novel doesn't ever function like an ending. In fact, in its purely formal nature, really, because it hinges on the form of involuntary memory, it in no way constrains what happens in those 2,000 pages. Right? So it's a wonderful kind of non-ending that really enables the next step, which is to basically leave all that behind and move on to telling the story that becomes the Albertine novel, or in 3 or 4 volumes of the Recherche. And so that was really helpful to me for understanding. That's the old architecture of the novel, which was Du côté chez Swann, Du côté Guermantes, and then Le Temps Retrouvé. And then you had this novel that Proust sort of sold to his editor by saying, oh, there's this architecture, and it all becomes clear when you see the spoon and the napkin and whatever in the end, and involuntary memory, and it has this through line of Marcel becoming a writer. Then the war also comes, and after the war, it was really helpful to me that I think it's Christine Cano in her book on Proust cites a mention by Proust in his correspondence that Albertine becomes the real center of his novel, right? That she becomes the active force and the real center of the novel. So then my argument really is, once that happens, the authority of the frame crumbles. And the problem for readers of Proust has been that story he sold to Jacques Rivière was so powerful. And who has the time to read 2,000 pages anyway? So to have this idea of this novel with this beginning and this end, he starts out in childhood, he eats the Madeleine, or the adult eats the Madeleine, recalls all of Combray, comes out of the cup of tea, and then you end up and he becomes the writer. Mm-hmm. So that's the important structure, I think, this notion of these two architectures. And the critic Bardèche had suggested that Albertine comes out of the notebook writings that had been about the theme of little girls. That was a theme. It's a theme in the novel as well, but it was a theme in the notebooks. And one of those passages that he quotes has the little girls, and in the end, they're grimacing comme dans une photographie tremblée, an out of focus photograph. Now, that then becomes the description, then it's layered into Proust's novel, right? It's the way the character Marcel perceives the girls on the beach. And then it's a photo of those same girls when they were little girls that's out of focus. So you have these three layers, the anticipatory, the draft text, the description of perception, and then the photographic snapshot of the little girls. And all of those are, that layering is very overdetermined. But what was interesting is also that Bardèche says that passage he cites of the little girls grimacing as if they were in a blurry photograph sits right at the limit between those two architectures of the novel, sort of in the manuscript. So it operates, he says, as a hinge between the old architecture and the new, which then launches the Albertine story. So I sort of say that Albertine emerges from a photograph because, in a sense, textually, through that those layers of draft material, genetic studies, this description in the actual novel, and then the ekphrasis of the photograph in the novel, she does seem to kind of emerge from that.
Yes, with all those fascinating passages between metaphor and narrative actualization that seems to keep happening
right
throughout. Okay, so let me zoom out. I want to zoom back in a minute, but let's use the photographic metaphor. Zoom out a bit. You want to write a book about Proust, as I said, the most commented author of all time, potentially the most commented massive work of all time. How do you go about situating yourself in relationship to the voluminous scholarship that exists? You engage it with a light touch in the book. It's not a meta commentary at all. You're not trying to adjudicate or navigate between competing accounts of Proust. You're kind of pursuing your own interest. But I was wondering, did other readings kind of loom large as you were writing or in your conceptualization, and how did you feel that the need to really explicitly situate yourself in relationship to those other readings or not?
I read as much as I could, and all of the sort of the large tradition of Proust scholarship, and some things interested me and some things less. And then I read as vastly as I could. What I was struck by was that how many studies, even studies in gender and sexuality and so forth, tended to nod to the assumptions about the vocation story and the idealist reading. So they never took it on. They sort of accommodated it, but the solution for doing that was to extract those elements out of the novel as a whole. So you would look at just certain passages where certain themes or the issue of sexuality, for example, comes into play. And my interest was in trying to reflect on how you think about this vast mammoth work, which is still and basically is now understood to be an unfinished work. So some of the criticism that helped me a lot was this kind of genetic criticism, like the Bardèche thing. He never talked about the photograph, but he did lay out certain energies in the genesis of the novel. When I started on this project, very little was written about Proust and photography, but soon there's Jean-François, I think it is, Chevriers' Proust et la photographie, which is very short and very helpful. And then there are individual articles. Luc Fraisse confirmed my feeling that Proust would have been interested in Gabriel Tarde, for example, because he has an essay on that. So then there are sort of very focused essays that reinforced my intuitions that I could use.
One of the authors who you do kind of take on in a way, or whose interpretation you explicitly engage in dialogue with, is Walter Benjamin, and so it seems like he, you see his argument is about Proust illustrates the historical loss of a collective structure of authentic experience. I mean, I don't want to, we don't want to get into too many details because people haven't read the book, but can you say a little bit about how Benjamin's reading serves as almost an antagonist for your own in this account?
Yeah, well, I had come through really just the textuality of Proust's novel. There's this narrative moment when the narrator describes the character looking at Albertine on the beach, and she's walking along, and all of a sudden she stops, and there's this present participle, like, which hovers in time for a minute, and then she becomes a memory, a thin image in his memory. So it was really interesting to me that that memory, after you get into the Albertine part of the novel, memory has to be produced. It's not in Combray. You can think, well, he's sitting there remembering everything and it's all in the past, and then he remembers and tells it. But as you get into the novel, what are the memories of Marcel have to be produced narratively. And then they act on the narrative, right? So there are these memory series, and the memory of douceur, of sort of desire-provoking memories, and then memory series of douleur, which pertain to jealousy. And so memory, and it's very Bergsonian, memory is active in the present. And also then I argue that it involves an improvisational kind of process that unfolds. But anyway, having focused on at length, because Proust underscores it so much, the importance of that image of Albertine by the sea, and says that it basically anticipates everything else that happens in the novel, I thought, well, wait a minute, he's just given a narrative account of the production of a memory at the same time as perceiving something. And then I realized that's exactly Bergson's theory in his essay on déjà vu. And then I realized, but there's a problem, because one of the greatest critics of Proust, Walter Benjamin, says that if you're going to read Proust, you have to read it through Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle. So it wasn't that I wanted to take on Benjamin. I mean, Benjamin was a translator of Proust. He knew it intimately. He had some of the best insights and intuitions about Proust. But my point was that the terms of his argument lent themselves to reappropriation within the idealist reading. Not that he had an idealist reading. So it's kind of a subtle point. But in footnotes, I cite about 4 articles that all appeal to a Benjaminian reading, and then end with the great thing about it's either essences or its textuality takes the place of essences, and it's basically the same move. So I felt like I couldn't just ignore the Benjamin and talk about a whole nother way of thinking about memory. I had to really work out confront the 2 theories of memory.
Right, with Bergson and Freud. That's a very...
Bergson is saying memory and perception happen together, and it's important because that's crucial to his whole philosophy of time. It's not an incidental point. It's linked to the fact that time arrives and splits into past and future, or past and present. And that's connected to the blur in Albertine, because he talks about déjà vu being a mémoire du présent. So you have this kind of skittish overlap between past and present, and that goes to his fundamental theory of time and matter and memory. So it wasn't that I would have preferred, I think, not to have to go into those rather technical pages, but also Benjamin talks about Bergson in this extremely complicated way. So there are, you have to move between Benjamin's essay on Baudelaire and his essay on Proust to get this story about the modernity of shock, right? That modernity changes our modes of perception. So I end up switching to Simmel's saying modernity shifts our way of believing, believing and desiring, right? So it's, and then you see that there are actually two versions of a similar analysis of modernity as a fundamental change of structures of existing. And so you should, in principle, be able to move between the two, right? So there is a difference in the theory of memory, because the Freudian theory of memory in Beyond the Pleasure Principle does suggest that first you perceive and have consciousness, and then you remember and record outside of consciousness. And Bergson is very clear that he understands that's the usual view of things, but he then goes on at great length to try to help us understand that in fact, they occur at the same time or right next to each other.
Right. There's a quote from Bergson, I think this is from Bergson, and not your paraphrase, that on time, that is important throughout your account, which is that the present doubles itself at every moment in its very emergence in two symmetrical streams, one of which falls back toward the past and the other reaches toward the future. So there's this splitting, doubling, back towards the past and reaching towards the future that is always transforming the present.
Arriving as present and becoming past, which then reactivates in the present. Yeah.
And at an amazing moment, you read that, my memory fails me a little, you read this in a Proust discussion of a photograph. I think it's an imaginary, and it might even be of himself. It's an academician teetering on the pavement just before falling, and it's almost like
that's in another moment. And if you don't mind, I'll just say a word about that. That there's this amazing episode in the grandmother story where he walks in on her apartment and on her in her apartment in Paris, and he sees her with camera eyes. And that's what launches my discussion of the sort of very modernist understanding of photography that Proust had. So he talks about the camera eyes, seeing his grandmother or seeing her through camera eyes. And then he immediately makes this statement about the problem with, he immediately goes on to distinguish between natural vision and mechanical vision. And he says the problem with natural vision is we never see what arrives from the future. We never see the present because we're carrying all of our formatted ideas, and that's because of our affect, right? So especially with people we love, you know, we see them the way they were 20 years ago. That can be advantageous at certain moments. But Simmel says the same thing, actually, that there's this problem with affect in interposing itself or interposing old images of the present. So it's actually not seeing what's happening. And then Proust has this little account of what mechanical vision would be like. And that's the one that's a little bit like, you know, a Buster Keaton movie, right? Where this bourgeois gentleman is slipping and falling on the ice, and it's this comic scene. But the idea is that the mechanical vision lets one see things that would have been edited out by the habit, really, as it has been affectively inscribed.
Yes, but there's also the interesting way that the future is already becoming present in the image, because normally when, you know, the normal account of photography is that it marks that has been in Barth's account, it's an inscription of the empirical reality.
It will have been past, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So here we've got this strange temporality of the photographic image, which is at once the splitting of the present towards the past and the arrival of the future.
Or the arrival from the future of what's coming and still is a bit future-ish or a future to come, which is what the modernist appropriation and the Russian formalist appropriation of certain strategies of photographing were about. And it linked to that fact that conventional vision or natural vision always let you see the way you thought things were in the past.
Right.
And only a certain kind of photographic formal maneuverings of the camera let you see the revolution, right? Which the revolution to come, right? In other words, what would be or could be arriving from the future. It's not so much like previewing a future scene, but it's like being forward looking to see what is on its way or what could be on its way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. I want to ask you about the interplay in the book between the philosophical account of time as what you know those philosophers developed what you describe as an ontology of time, and your kind of parallel interest in historicization. For example, in the Albertine section, you show how specific photographic genres and technologies, including the stereoscope, introduce tropes of pornography and prostitution into the treatment of Albertine, rendering her somewhat less mysterious. And then, of course, the argument in part 3 deals with the Panama scandal of 1892 and the Dreyfus affair and the kind of anti-Semitism, as well as the historical establishment of the money economy. All of this is absolutely central to what was played out in relation to specific photographic technologies. There's illustrated newspapers, there's point and shoot, there's daguerreotypes appear at different moments, and each has a very specific role in your account. So there's a historical reading, and there's also, I think, there is a kind of ontological argument, or Ravesson calls habit the primordial law of being. So how do you navigate the tension between the kind of historical and the existential or ontological aspects of your account of time and photography?
I don't find them to be in tension. And partly it's because one major territory or focus is the novel, right? So in a way, the literary dimension requires looking at the historical basis for certain things that only become meaningful I was pretty amazed to see Proust basically riffing off of Jean Jaurès, for example, yeah. Not only in his account of the Panama scandal, but the way he'd set up his description of the new Guermantes salon is exactly repeating what Jaurès had said about the way money is decomposing society because of this capitalist moment. So because of the scandal. That's one thing, that the historical is the cultural. And, unless you believe in a transcendental aesthetic world, which often discussions of Proust and painting tend to suggest, then it all has to be historical. And that's part of being, the time of life, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. So the time of life includes that the past works on the present, that there are all these different settings. So in other words, the discourse of the daguerreotype survives much longer than the practice of making daguerreotypes. And people still think photographs are supposed to be giving objectivity, whereas commercial photography has already disrupted that by responding to market forces, mm-hmm. right? So I don't feel a tension there. And then in addition, on the philosophical level, for someone like Simmel, there's no difference between ontology is social. Mm-hmm. There is no, so it's the feature of immanence tied to this particular philosophical perspective or philosophical interest that makes it so that there isn't a tension between that kind of philosophical perspective and a historical or contextualizing one. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I try to bring out towards the end of the book and the conclusion, in talking about how I think Proust is actually, and he uses the language of the question of the real,
Mm-hmm.
being interested in what's real, not what's true.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's part of his Proust twice carries out a criticism of what Bergson calls the cinematographic, and also criticizes as an attempt to insert a discourse of truth or a presentation of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what all of these philosophers of life are interested in is something some of them call the real, which is existential. It happens.
Yeah.
It's based on things that happen in time, like lived time. So if you're thinking about time from that perspective as lived time, there isn't any kind of outside absolute transcendental tension or separation between an ontology of time, which, you know, Simmel expresses, I think, the most explicitly when he says time is real for life alone, in a certain way, only living. And Bergson had said something similar.
Mm-hmm.
I know if that answers your.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't experience it as a tension, because both the historical aspects of your argument and the philosophical, they seem compatible. Speaking of the real as opposed to the true, poor cinema gets it stands in for the kind of empirical mapping of time in the chronophotographic way, kind of a spatializing of time. This is for Bergson, so I'm not going to ask you to defend his. I mean, that's a.
Well, it's important to understand that he's not talking about cinema. Bergson's not talking about cinema.
Right.
So, and that's where it becomes, I think, possibly a false argument.
Yeah.
He also uses the metaphor of a puzzle, right? Bergson uses the metaphor of the puzzle to say that, you know, when children put a puzzle together and they already know what the image is going to look like of the puzzle, then they're not really learning anything new. They're just repiecing together what they already thought. Right.
Yeah.
That if you want to sort of buffer cinema from the cinematographic, you could think about it in terms of the puzzle. But what the chronophotography lets, and there are all sorts of reasons why Bergson is, I think, annoyed by the cinematograph, which was that Marais posed it as an instrument of truth, the truth of the living, right? He basically said, I can reveal the truth of the movement of living beings by this process. And that goes absolutely counter to everything Bergson has always said, which is that kind of thinking is great, but it can't think about life. So it's a very specific and actually much more powerful argument in the Bergson than I think most people take account of. It's really a critique, not of cinema, but of all of Western philosophy. Right.
Yeah.
And it's also an invitation to think what he calls the interval, which is the space between the cutout and re-put together images. And so in a sense, that's the space of the blur where Albertine lives and where, in a sense, the intermittence lived in the earlier discussion in the book.
Right, exactly. Intermittence and blur, intermittence in the first part, blur in the second, being names of this complex temporal operation that is registered in the photographs. If we had more time, I would want to ask you about Deleuze and the time image. That's going to be for your next, for another book. But there's some questions coming through, and I also want to invite listeners to address your questions in the YouTube questions box. So one person asks if you could say more about the war that you mentioned earlier, given its importance in, you know, modernity and in changing our ideas of memory and time.
Yeah, there have been some books on that question of how the war impacted the production of Proust's novel, how it intervened in it. In my work in this book, I actually end on that note. in talking about a sense of urgency that Proust might have felt to have put forth a different point of view. And it has to do, it's a bit complicated because it relates to Simmel's analysis of what he calls objectivation, which is seeing that when there is an affective object that is constructed as well as sort of a cognitive object that gets constructed. And what's interesting about Simmel is he says they're both objective. It's not like one is, the affective is all subjective and the other is objective. And that opens up a lot of possibilities for thinking about ideology, right? If the what he calls the volitional object is real and is objective. So at a certain moment in Le Temps Retrouvé, Proust's narrator talks about Charlus's Germanophilia during the war, right? That Charlus does not hold back from expressing his admiration for the Germans during the war. And the narrator says that he found that shocking, but he also, through it, came to see that the nationalist response to that, which was to hate all Germans, was also as dangerous, that would hate all Germans and treat them as inhuman. And then he said, he compares that to a moment when he and Saint-Loup were looking at photographs of their lovers, right? And that for one, that was just a photograph of Albertine for Saint-Loup was just the girl he was supposed to go find because she'd run away. Whereas for Marcel, it's like, it's the woman he adores at that moment. And so there's this way in which photography, once again, is being compared to something that reveals objectification as this construction of an identity or construction of an object or an object of love in relation to one's desires or beliefs, right? So it seemed to me that that was a very important moment in the recherche that basically says we need to examine something other than pure objectivity or truth, you know, or pure subjectivity or mystification. And that's really where a lot of Proust's novel happens, is and Albertine is later described as exactly that by the narrator, that it's the assemblage that he has put together of his own memory images. So that's another example where desire and vitality is entering into the real. And it's part of what, when Proust says at a certain moment, everything is more complex than you think and that needs to be seen, I took that to be very much about the war.
Okay, we have quite a few questions that have filtered in, but only 6 minutes. So maybe I'll read you a few of them, and you can choose which one to answer. I also had hoped to read a quote about Odette, the amazing way that you describe Odette's production of herself as a kind of photograph that's like a mask that freezes time, and she has the effect that she kind of strangely looks younger later than she did before. And also in that section we have the idea of the photograph as being profoundly social.
But this is commercial photography, and that's the crucial difference, because the market is intervening.
Right.
And so it's a discourse of weighing beauty and ugliness together and creating a kind of a type that is socially imagined.
Right, that's an incredible analysis. So let me read you some of what people have said. These comments are all anonymous, or at least I can't see who asked them. So one person says, this is a compelling discussion of Proust. Is it also a discussion of the modern novel that we could expand out in, that would be relevant to other modern novels, I suppose, in terms of the philosophy of time or the time of life? Okay, and another person asks, how would you reconcile Proust's rather optimistic view of the individual's relation to culture with Simmel's famously tragic culture? And then we have a question about cinema, motion pictures had been invented around the time of Proust's birth. Color and sound came towards the end of his life, yet he never went to see a movie, according to both Taddy and Carter. Why? So that, and then the other question is, what is the photo on the cover of your book? You can see on my marked pages here. This is an amazing photo that I think is an anonymous snapshot, but maybe you can tell us about.
Yeah, let me start with that one because it's the easiest one to respond to. That's a photograph that I discovered at the Nice-Forniepce Museum in France. And it was amidst other stereoscopic images that were shown for entertainment in the Jardin Luxembourg. So when I saw that in the museum, I said, oh my God, that's Albertine and her friends. There's no question to my mind. I felt that very strongly. But what I think what I thought about it was that it suggests that the character Albertine does represent a kind of figure in the social imaginary at that time. If people are spending a few pennies or whatever in the Jardin Luxembourg to see these images, they're not so explicitly pornographic in any way. They're sort of the scenes of the beach, which was this interesting, somewhat new social space. So it does have to do with like a gesture on my part of trying to get away from an excessive individualizing and individualism that people often associate with Proust. And it's often a pretext for dismissing Proust, like it's the bourgeois individual, how boring. Whereas you can also see it as working with social and cultural types. And I felt that this image represented that. And I like the image also because it's fun. And it does recall that sense of a more vitality and energy in living that I think is also in Proust's book, as well as the suffering and so forth.
Mm-hmm. We probably have time only for one more. Do you want to do the modern novel or the Zimmel's?
I don't feel I can speak in that kind of generality about the modern novel. I would love it if anyone found any inspiration in this book on Proust to take in that direction. And certainly there have been discussions about other novelists and, conceptions of time. And so where one might go with that, I think I'm sure there are ways to carry that towards other modern novels, but I don't feel equipped to speak to that point. The other question about Zimmel, again, I've been trying to do a very, in a way, kind of pointillé linking of philosophical and cultural and literary moments. And so you have to see whether you think in reading the book that they add up and articulate adequately to satisfy you. But I'm not interested in matching global views of things so much. So it doesn't matter to me if Zimmel also has a tragic view of culture. He also has an extremely lively view of culture that is a function of interaction and relations. I mean, as a sociologist, his understanding of social, so maybe social means more to him than culture. And that might be an interesting distinction to make. And I'm not trying to say that Proust is optimistic either, but I'm trying to say it's alive. And it's about concrete complexity in the world. And that's where the sort of virtuosity of his perceptions and wit and understanding and dynamic he can put into his writing makes it important to read.
So we have to wrap up. I thought I would read one quote about the grandmother's photograph that we didn't get to talk too much about. There's so many parts that I wanted to read, but this addresses the kind of typical traditional understandings of photography. And you say that the photograph of Marcel's grandmother challenges basic assumptions about the nature of photography, namely what André Bazin, the French film theorist, calls its essentially objective character. And I'm no longer quoting, but this reveals the that the photograph doesn't so much hold the imprint of the objective real, but as you say, too much time. And so the inscription of intermittence, there's too much time, and therefore the grandmother's photo is unstable. And that instability, the too much of intermittence, and the kind of that fractured temporality of the past splitting off and the past.
Yeah, I think it was the blur I was suggesting has too much time because it shows time at work. I mean, because it reveals traces of movement. So
Right.
it's the perfect example of that interval moment that is the moment that's ontologically primary for Bergson.
Right. Yeah, that's where the blur is the kind of visualization of intermittence. The blur kind of
Right. It's like it condenses intermittence and accelerates it.
yeah.
Um,
So
so that point that you raised about the critique of objectivity, it's because that one scene of the camera eyes was read by almost every critic I came across as sort of an appeal to objectivity on Proust's part. And I read it very differently, that on the one hand, there's a intertextual photograph. So it's a photograph, it's a scene about a photograph, the photograph of that Degas took of their friend. And then it's also anticipating very precisely things that happen in the novel. And so I did a very different reading of that scene and also connected it to modernist theories of photography that are linked to a version of objectivity which is tied to defamiliarization and estrangement, and sort of privileged Proust's interest in that kind of photography as opposed to being a question of truth. He talks about seeing Albertine when he kisses her as if it was one of the million things Albertine could be, right? That's what photography, I think, is for Proust, not an objective correlate.
He makes a reference to the kind of contemporary techniques of photography at that moment too. I think you discussed that as well. Suzanne, we've run out of time, unfortunately. Speaking of time, it would be wonderful there's so much more we can get into. This is a very, very rich book, and so I encourage everybody to read it. It really is something to savor. And thank you so much for coming to speak to us about
Thank you, Damon, for being my interlocutor and reading it so carefully, and for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.